Laura Bennett arrived at Seattle General in Colorado Springs at 11:33 p.m., the way she had arrived every night for 3 years, early, quiet, invisible. She moved through the corridors with the kind of practice neutrality that comes from having learned to disappear, her scrubs one size too large, her name badge clipped low where it wouldn't catch light. The fluorescent tubes hummed their fluorescent hymn above her head as she passed the break room, the nurse's station, the supply closet where she kept her coat folded precisely on the second shelf. Nobody looked at her. That was the point. The night shift at Seattle General was the graveyard where unremarkable nurses went to be forgotten, and that was exactly what Captain Laura Bennett needed. She had been erased once already, 3 years ago, after Helmand Province, after the Pentagon had scrubbed her records and handed her a file stamped classified with a single verbal instruction: disappear. Don't make noise. Don't draw attention. Don't exist in any way that matters. So she became the nurse that residents forgot to introduce, the one they called the quiet one, the one whose hands moved with surgical precision but whose voice never rose above a whisper. When Dr. Sherman asked her to grab a 20-gauge needle, she simply retrieved it. When Charge Nurse Davies made a joke about something stupid, Laura smiled without showing teeth and returned to her charting. Her jacket hung in her locker, the same Navy-issue windbreaker she'd worn in 2019, the fabric still holding the smell of diesel fuel and Afghan dust beneath the antiseptic she'd run through the laundry 100 times. Inside the left lining, almost invisible, was the faded unit patch she'd sewn by hand during a sleepless night in 2020. Coast Guard insignia. Worn thin from touching. She had kept it because burning it felt like burning a ghost, and the ghost was the only thing keeping her alive. At 11:52 p.m., as she pulled on nitrile gloves and began her station rounds, Dr. Pierce walked past the medication cabinet. He was 42, carried himself like wealth had taught him to walk, and wore his stethoscope the way a general wears insignia, not as a tool but as a symbol of rank. He'd been at Seattle General for 8 months, running the experimental intervention unit with a kind of autonomy that usually required board approval but somehow never seemed to get questioned when his billing reports hit the finance office. Laura had noticed this. She had also noticed, because of the 3 years of careful invisibility, because of the trauma assessment training in her muscles, because of the part of her that could never fully stop being a captain, that his patient charts contained timestamps that didn't match the procedures listed. 1 CT angiography billed at 3:08 a.m. for a patient who was still in the waiting room at 3:51 a.m., according to the intake log. She hadn't said anything. Saying things meant being noticed. Pierce paused at the medication cabinet, his eyes tracking across the room with the specific intensity of a man solving a problem. When his gaze landed on her, something shifted in his expression, a calculation, sharp and sudden, like watching a predator identify prey. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Laura didn't smile back. She simply returned to organizing the supply cart, her movements economical, her posture bent slightly forward in the stance of someone making themselves smaller. The jacket with the unit patch was in her locker. The part of her that had led reconnaissance teams through Sanjin Valley was locked in a cabinet marked "Do Not Disturb." She had gotten very good at compartmentalization. The ER doors burst open at 12:03 a.m. with the particular urgency that paramedics used when someone was actively dying. The sound cut through the ambient hum of the hospital like a blade, urgent, sharp, the radio chatter of voices trained to remain calm while describing catastrophe. Laura's head lifted instinctively. 2 decades of muscle memory doesn't disappear because you change your job and your name and your existence. The stretcher wheel squeaked against the tile floor, fast and purposeful, and she heard the paramedic calling vitals before the team even entered the trauma bay. Blast injury, shrapnel penetrating left thorax, pressure dressing in place, blood loss approximately 2 liters pre-hospital, respiratory distress, O2 sat at 88 on supplemental, heart rate 120 and climbing, we've got pneumothorax on the left side, trachea deviating, get him straight to trauma. Laura was already moving, muscle memory overriding the careful neutrality she'd maintained for 3 years. She positioned herself at the entrance to Trauma Bay 2, hands reaching for equipment before her conscious mind had finished processing what her body already knew. The paramedics wheeled through, and she saw him, Commander James Reeves, Coast Guard medic, the man who had taken over her unit after she was officially dead. She had never met him in person, but the chain of command newsletter that somehow still reached her forwarding address had included his photo 3 years ago. Promotion. Commendation. Photo caption: Medic Reeves assumes leadership of Angel Company following personnel changes. His chest was a geography of trauma. The blast had opened his left side in a pattern that told a story she could read like a map: the shrapnel trajectory, the estimated force, the tissue damage beneath skin that was already beginning to show the pallor of blood loss. His breathing was wrong. She could hear it immediately: the breath sounds asymmetrical, the left side nearly silent, the retractions visible above his clavicle and between his ribs. This was a lung that was collapsing. This was a chest that was filling with air that had nowhere to escape. "Get him on the monitor," someone was shouting. "Page Dr. Pierce, he's handling this case." The resident was panicked, competent, but panicked, the voice of someone watching something fail in real time and not knowing how to stop it. Laura positioned herself at his left side, her hands already moving to cut away the field dressing. Her fingers worked with the kind of precision that comes from trauma assessment training at the tactical medicine level, the kind of training that gets embedded in your nervous system so deeply that 3 years of civilian nursing can't erase it. She traced the wound pattern, assessed the angle of penetration, noted the absence of breath sounds on the left side, the distended neck veins, the way his chest wall was moving in a pattern that didn't match his breathing pattern. Paradoxical breathing. Pneumothorax. The lung was collapsing, and she could see the question forming in the resident's eyes: what does this quiet nurse know that should require this level of assessment? She kept her voice soft. Breath sounds absent on the left side, distended jugulars, tracheal deviation. Tension pneumothorax developing. The resident blinked. "How did you—" "I mean, yes, that's what I was thinking, but we need to page Dr. Pierce." "He's coming," someone else said. The trauma team was assembling now: residents, nurses, techs moving through the practiced choreography of emergency response. But there was something in the room, something in the quality of the silence beneath the activity, that made Laura's military-trained senses go sharp. The residents were looking at each other with a specific expression, the expression of people trying to solve a problem they didn't want to touch. Dr. Pierce arrived at 12:07 a.m., and his eyes went directly to the chart, not to the patient. He stood at the foot of the trauma bay, posture relaxed, scanning the documentation with an expression of perfect confidence. His gaze moved across the monitor, across the wound, across the blood pressure reading that was dropping in increments that made mathematics out of mortality. Then his eyes found Laura, and the calculation returned. She was leaning slightly forward, one hand positioned near the trauma cart, her posture suggesting she was preparing to assist. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. The scar tissue on her forearms was visible, pale, ridged, the kind of scarring that comes from burns, from blast fragmentation, from things that happen in places where civilians aren't supposed to be. She didn't notice his attention. She was focused entirely on the patient, on the monitor, on the geometry of the wound that was telling her a story that should have required years of surgical training to read. Something flickered across Pierce's expression: recognition, perhaps, but not of her face. Recognition of a problem. This nurse saw things. This nurse moved with the certainty of someone who had made life-and-death assessments before. This nurse, if allowed to remain in this room, would be looking at the billing documentation on his experimental treatment protocol, and she would notice the same timestamp anomalies that he had already erased from 3 other patient files. She would notice. And she would remember. He smiled that smile again, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll take it from here," Pierce said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made residents step back. "Prep for the experimental protocol, we'll try the advanced hemostatic intervention first. Get a chest tube ready in case we need surgical backup." Laura's hands paused, a fraction of a second too brief for anyone else to notice. The experimental protocol meant something. It meant expensive. It meant questionable. It meant the kind of intervention that gets billed at rates that require careful documentation to justify. She straightened slightly, maintaining her invisibility, but something in her bearing had shifted, the subtle shift of someone whose attention has locked onto something they didn't expect to see. Pierce's eyes tracked the shift with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he'd just watched. Problem identified. Problem being observed. Problem needed to be removed. The smile stayed on his face, but his hand was already moving toward the trauma bay door, already calculating the sequence of events that would begin with a humiliation so public, so complete, that this quiet nurse would be gone before she had time to examine a single questionable line item. The stretcher's wheels continued their squeak against the tile floor, a sound like small bones breaking, and outside the windows of Seattle General in Colorado Springs, the night pressed dark and indifferent against the glass. Thursday grand round started like every other week, 30 residents and attending physicians filling the conference room with the particular arrogance that comes from wearing white coats in a hospital where no one questions their authority. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment, his hand moving toward the projector remote like a conductor raising a baton. The screen flickered to life and Laura's patient assessment notes appeared, magnified and sterile under the fluorescent lights. Her handwriting, careful and precise, filled the slide, vital signs documented to the decimal, rhythm strips analyzed with the kind of attention that usually takes 15 years to develop. Pierce circled sections with a red laser pointer, the dot moving like a hunting predator across the screen. This, he announced, his voice carrying the particular disdain reserved for those he considered beneath him, is what happens when we lower our standards. He turned to face the rows of residents, all of them leaning forward with the hunger of students waiting to learn which nurse to dismiss. Community college programs handing out credentials like participation trophies. We have a nurse here at Seattle General, very well-meaning, I'm sure, drafting care plans like she's playing doctor on a television show. Laughter rippled through the conference room, the kind that feeds on itself, multiplying with each voice until it fills all the available space. Laura sat in the back row, spine straight against the hard plastic chair, her face composed as weathered concrete. She had survived Helmand Province with less preparation than this moment required, had held bleeding Marines while helicopter rotors shook the ground beneath her feet, had made decisions that meant the difference between 17 people going home and 17 flag-folded boxes arriving at their families' doors. A laugh from a resident in the third row was nothing. It was air movement. It was noise. Pierce called her name 3 times, actually used scrubs instead of her name, a small cruelty designed to make the residents notice that he didn't think her worth the syllables. Scrubs, he said, could you come explain your creative interpretation of this cardiac rhythm here? His tone made it clear he was offering her a rope, already tied into a noose. She stood without hesitation, walked to the front of the conference room with the kind of steady gait that comes from understanding your own center of gravity, and looked at the rhythm strip on the screen. It took her 4 seconds to see what he'd done. The rhythm he was highlighting as evidence of her incompetence wasn't a rhythm at all, it was artifact, electrical noise from a loose telemetry lead, and the timestamp on the strip showed exactly what had happened. The monitor tech had flagged it 2 minutes later and the arrhythmia had resolved the moment the lead was resecured. She could have pointed out his error politely. She could have smiled and deferred. Instead, she said in a flat monotone that somehow made the silence heavier, that's artifact from a loose lead. Telemetry tech corrected it at 1402. You're looking at the rhythm on a disconnected electrode. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant electronic hum, a sound like the world's smallest electric chair. Pierce's jaw tightened, his smile staying fixed to his face like a mask someone had stapled in place, but she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. He'd miscalculated, used her to make a point and accidentally proved her competence instead. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, a gesture meant to restore his authority, but authority doesn't work that way once it's questioned by someone who wasn't supposed to be able to speak. Laura returned to her seat and felt 12 sets of resident eyes on her for the remaining 15 minutes of grand rounds, but she didn't look up. She already knew what they were thinking. She'd heard it before, in Helmand, when men with more rank but less sense learned that competence doesn't care about hierarchy. 2 hours later, she stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor's north corridor, selecting a coffee from row DR4. The fluorescent light inside the machine cast her face in sickly green, catching the small scar along her left temple that most people never noticed, the kind of thin white line that comes from shrapnel traveling at subsonic speed. She heard the footsteps before she saw the shadows. Pierce approached with 4 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark, all of them positioned to witness whatever was about to happen. He had staged this perfectly. No witnesses who might defend her, only subordinates learning how to break people. "Tell me, Scrubs," he said loudly enough that his voice carried down the hallway and bounced off tile, loud enough that a nurse stationed 40 feet away at the medication cart could hear every word clearly. "Do community college nursing programs even teach basic assessment anymore, or did they just hand you a certificate for showing up?" The resident snickered on cue, a sound like hyenas practicing their hunting calls. Laura turned slowly, her coffee cup still in her hand, and met his eyes with a stare so cold and flat it felt like looking into a well with no bottom. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She listened to his entire performance. He questioned her education, suggested she'd be better suited to changing bedpans, implied that critical patients shouldn't have to endure her incompetence, made it clear that her continued presence at Seattle General was an embarrassment to the profession. Each word was calculated to humiliate, to make the residents comfortable with viewing her as less than, to establish a hierarchy so clear that no one would question his authority when he made his next move. When he finally stopped, when he'd exhausted his prepared remarks and was waiting for her to react with something appropriately submissive, she said, "You build a CT angiogram for Commander Reeves at 1400 hours. Invoice timestamps for hours early. Patient hasn't left the ER yet." The words came out in a voice like ice forming, flat and clear and impossible to misinterpret. She turned and walked away before he could respond, her pace measured and unhurried, the kind of walk that says I'm leaving because I choose to leave, not because you intimidated me. Behind her, Pierce's face drained of all color, the blood retreating from his skin like it had suddenly realized what his brain was processing. The residents stopped snickering. One of them actually stepped backward, creating distance between himself and Pierce like illness might be contagious. But that wasn't the worst part. The real threat came that afternoon when Laura returned to Commander Reeves's bedside to check his post-trauma vitals and found Pierce already waiting there with 2 security guards positioned on either side of him like bookends. The guards wore the particular expression of people who had been told this was serious, that they needed to project authority even if they didn't understand what they were guarding against. "Commander Reeves is no longer your responsibility," Pierce announced, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry but loud enough that nearby staff would strain to hear. "In fact, you're suspended pending investigation into documentation falsification." He wasn't yelling. That was the dangerous part. Anger screams. Certainty speaks in a measured tone. His hand was extended, expecting her to surrender her badge, the laminated plastic rectangle that opened every door in the hospital, that said she had the right to be here. "You've falsified patient records," he continued, his eyes never wavering from hers. "You've overridden physician orders. You're practicing medicine without a license, and I've already contacted the state nursing board with evidence." He smiled then, and it was a smile like a wolf showing its teeth before it attacks. "My colleague from Johns Hopkins sits on their disciplinary committee. You should start thinking about career alternatives." The room seemed to compress around her. 3 nurses at the station looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. A resident vanished into the stairwell. The monitor above Reeves's bed beeped its steady rhythm, 82 beats per minute, and that small sound was the only thing that kept her from doing something she would regret. She raised her hand slightly, a gesture of surrender, and removed her badge from around her neck. The laminate was warm from her skin. She held it out, and one of the security guards took it, their fingers careful not to touch hers, as if contamination might transfer. She walked away from Reeves's bedside, from the monitor that was already showing the first signs of what was coming, and moved to the nurse's station where she continued charting on her other patients, watching Reeves's room from 20 feet away. At 1900 hours his oxygen saturation began to drift down from 94 to 91. The downward slope was gentle, the kind of decline that could be attributed to normal post-trauma settling, but she knew better. She'd seen that pattern in Helmand when soldiers were developing tension pneumothorax, when air was collecting in the pleural space and slowly, inexorably, compressing the lung. She approached the charge nurse, a 20-year veteran named Susan with grey streaking through her hair and the kind of exhaustion that comes from working double shifts. His trachea deviating, Laura said quietly. "He needs immediate decompression." Susan glanced down the hallway where Pierce was visible through the glass office walls, talking on his cell phone with the kind of animated intensity that suggested he was building something, laying groundwork, making calls. "You're suspended," Susan whispered back, and there was genuine regret in her voice. "I can't let you near him." By 2100 hours, Reeves's saturation had dropped to 88 and his respiratory rate had climbed to 34 breaths per minute, his body struggling to compensate for the collapsing lung, gasping like a drowning man already underwater. Pierce had elevated his response. He had the CEO on speakerphone, 2 board members conferenced in from their evening dinners, and he was texting hospital legal counsel with the kind of rapid-fire precision that suggested he'd been planning this for longer than just the past 6 hours. 12 attending physicians, every senior doctor in the hospital with the authority to override him, had crowded into the hallway outside Reeves's room, reviewing his deteriorating vitals, but none of them would touch him. Pierce had made it clear that anyone who contradicted his treatment plan would face the same board review, the same scrutiny, the same calculated destruction. Authority is contagious, and fear spreads faster than hope. So they stood in the hallway and watched the monitor decline, and none of them moved. The hallway outside Reeves's room felt like the moment before a firefight, that suspended breath when you know the bullets are coming but haven't heard them yet. Laura stood at the nurse's station, her hands gripping the counter edge until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. The monitor above Reeves's bed screamed its alarm in a rhythm that made her spine remember things she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. 23:30 hours. Just past 11 at night. She watched the numbers collapse like a building under demolition. Oxygen saturation 74% and falling. His trachea shifted visibly to the right, a deviation that meant his left lung was drowning in air trapped inside his chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of emergency that kills in minutes if nobody moves. His jugular veins distended like ropes pulled tight through his neck, his body's scream made visible. All 12 attending physicians stood frozen in the hallway outside the glass partition, their hands at their sides, their eyes fixed on the monitor like it might suddenly start making decisions for them. Dr. Chen reached for the crash cart, just a reflex, just muscle memory, but Pierce's voice cut across the room before the resident's fingertips touched the metal frame. Nobody touches him until legal arrives. This is now an active investigation scene. The phone was still pressed to Pierce's ear. He'd been on it for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Laura had stopped counting. He was speaking to someone with a title. She could hear the deference in his voice, the careful construction of narrative. The CEO. A board member. A medical investigator from the state board who went to medical school with him, probably played squash with him on weekends, definitely owed him favors the way men with money and credentials always owed each other favors. A rogue nurse, Pierce was saying, his voice steady and reasonable, the voice of a concerned physician protecting patients from dangerous incompetence. Attempting to practice medicine without a license. She exposed confidential patient billing information. She's becoming increasingly unstable. The staff is afraid of her. I believe she may be having a mental health crisis. The lie was so clean it barely made a sound. Laura's cold stare swept across the 12 doctors frozen in that hallway. Pierce. Dr. Chen, second-year resident, barely 30, with a mortgage and student loans that would take him until his 60s to pay down. Rodriguez, the trauma attending, whose daughter had just gotten into Yale. Kim, the ICU specialist, who'd been passed over for chief of staff twice and couldn't afford another blemish on her record. 3 more residents whose names she knew but whose faces had already begun to blur with the weight of what they weren't doing. 5 staff physicians clustered together like prey animals hoping the predator wouldn't notice them. 12 doctors, and not one of them moved toward the room. Not because they believed Pierce. Laura could see it in their eyes, they knew what they were seeing. A competent nurse performing under pressure. A dying patient who needed intervention. A system that had trained them to save lives failing to function because one man with institutional leverage had weaponized their fear. But fear moved faster than courage in hospitals. Fear had lawyers. Fear had CEOs and board members and investigators on speed dial. Courage just had a stethoscope and a conscience, and those things paid the rent in exactly 0 zip codes. The monitor alarm continued its electronic shriek. Heart rate 142. Blood pressure 92/56 and dropping like a stone down a well. 70% oxygen saturation. 68. The numbers told a story that was simple and brutal. This man had maybe 4 minutes before his heart stopped pumping blood to his brain. Laura moved her gaze to Reeves's face through the glass. Eyes half closed. Skin the color of wet cement. His left side, the injury side, rising and falling in movements that looked panicked, desperate, a body fighting for air it couldn't find. She'd seen this look before. In Helmand Province. In a compound outside Sanjin Valley. On the faces of soldiers who understood that everyone had decided to let them die. She looked away from his face and looked instead at what she would need. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. The second and third intercostal space. The midclavicular line. Muscle memory had already started cataloging positions, landmarks, the exact angle of approach. Her hands were steady in a way that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the fact that panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. Then she thought of her daughter. 7 years old. Hair the color of winter wheat. Asking Mommy, "Why are you home?" this morning when she was supposed to be finishing her shift, not being escorted to HR, asking, "Why are you crying?" while Laura sat at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with documents that said she was a safety risk, a liability, a problem that needed to be contained. The thinking stopped. The movement began. She pushed away from the counter and walked toward Reeves's room. Her stride was measured. Her jaw was locked. Her hands felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the fact that she was about to end whatever fragile normal life she'd built in this place. But Reeves was going to die in the next 300 seconds if she didn't, and she'd already spent 3 years learning how to live with impossible choices. Pierce saw her coming. His body language shifted, shoulders straightening, phone arm dropping slightly, his presence expanding to fill the doorway like he was about to make himself immovable. He stepped directly into her path, his frame blocking the entrance to the room completely. The phone was still pressed to his ear. "If you enter that room," he said, each word carefully enunciated, "I will have you arrested for assault and practicing medicine without a license. You will never work in a hospital again. You will face criminal charges. Do you understand me?" Laura met his eyes. The stare was flat. Cold. Empty of everything except certainty. She said nothing. She shoved past him hard enough that his body stumbled backward into the hallway, his left arm windmilling to maintain balance, the phone flying from his grip. His voice never wavered, he kept talking to whoever was on the other end, his words tripping over themselves as his body crashed into Dr. Chen and Rodriguez behind him. "She's assaulting me, she just assaulted me in front of witnesses." Laura was already through the doorway. The smell hit her first. Antiseptic and something underneath it, something organic and wrong, the smell of a body drowning in its own chemistry. Reeves's monitor was screaming its alarm rhythm, and she moved to the bedside in 3 long strides that felt like floating, like the entire world had shifted into a slower time signature that only her body understood. "Saturation 64, she said, her voice carrying the weight of command, and Dr. Chen appeared at her shoulder despite Pierce's voice still shouting from the hallway. The words were coming faster now, more desperate, the investigation narrative cracking under the pressure of real-time crisis. Laura's hands were already moving. She felt for the second rib, felt for the third intercostal space below it, felt for the midclavicular line that would mark her approach. The landmark was there, always there, her fingers reading the geometry of his ribs like braille. The needle was in her hand before she'd consciously decided to pick it up. The 14-gauge angiocath gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its metal catching the white glare like a piece of truth in a room full of lies. "What are you doing?" Pierce's voice came from behind her, and there was something different in it now. The careful construction was gone. What remained was raw, exposed, the sound of institutional authority recognizing that it might lose. Laura didn't answer. She positioned the needle perpendicular to Reeves's chest wall and pushed through the skin with the smooth, certain pressure of someone who had done this before, who had done this under fire, who had done this while artillery rounds shook the ground and dust fell like snow. The needle advanced through subcutaneous tissue, through the fascia of the external intercostal muscles, deeper, and then the hiss. Compressed air escaping in a sound like a tire deflating, like a sigh released from deep inside the earth. The tension pneumothorax releasing. The pressure that had been crushing Reeves's left lung, compressing his heart, killing him with every passing second, suddenly gone. The monitor responded immediately. Heart rate dropping from 142 to 131. 128. Blood pressure rising. 84. 86. Oxygen saturation climbing, 72. 75. 80. Get a chest tube kit, Laura said, and Dr. Chen was already moving, his fear replaced by the clarity that came from watching a salvageable situation actually be salvaged. Type and cross 6 units. Push another amp of epi while we set up for thoracostomy. Her voice had changed. The words came out weighted with an authority that had nothing to do with her title and everything to do with the fact that she was the only person in this room who understood the architecture of survival. Not because of any credential. Not because of any permission slip she'd been given. But because she'd learned it in places where mistakes meant body bags, and the cost of hesitation was measured in lives, and the only currency that mattered was competence. Pierce stood frozen in the doorway. The phone was on the floor. His hand was hanging at his side, palm up, empty. He was watching her work, watching her save the life that he'd decided to let die, and Laura could see the moment he understood that he'd made a calculation error. That he'd identified the wrong threat. That the nurse he'd dismissed, mocked, weaponized bureaucracy against, was the only person standing between his patient and a body bag. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she could see it in his face, the exact moment he realized who she really was. Not because of anything she'd said or done. But because competence at this level, this kind of surgical certainty, this kind of calm in the center of a crisis, this wasn't something you learned at a community college nursing program. This was something you learned in military field hospitals. This was something you learned leading soldiers through fire. His face went pale. Not with shame. Not with fear. But with the dawning recognition that he'd just tried to destroy someone who had already survived worse things than he could imagine, and that maybe, just maybe, that decision had been the worst mistake he could have made. 23:30 hours. The monitor alarm screams like something wounded. Reeves's oxygen saturation plummets, 74%, 71, 68. His trachea shifts visibly to the right, the skin above his collarbone pulling inward with each failed breath attempt, his body fighting for air that won't come. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung pressing against his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. One of the attending physicians steps toward the bed. Then stops. Looks back at the doorway where Dr. Pierce stands with his phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp as a scalpel. I don't care if she's in the middle of a procedure. Call the CEO. Tell him we have a rogue nurse practicing medicine without a license. I want her arrested before she kills my patient. The physician retreats. Moves back to the wall with the other 11. 12 doctors. 12 silent witnesses. The room fills with the sound of Reeves struggling to breathe, or a wet, ragged gasping that shouldn't exist in a hospital where breathing is supposed to be managed, controlled, saved. Laura stands at the medication station, watching the monitor cascade into red warnings. She counts the frozen physicians, 1 by the window, 2 near the doorway, 3 clustered by the medication cart, 1 leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, 4 more lined up like spectators at an execution. 12. All of them trained to move in crisis. All of them paralyzed by the voice of a man with institutional power. She understands paralysis. She's seen it before, soldiers who know what needs to be done but can't move because someone with rank or authority has commanded them to stand still. She's never understood it. Never accepted it. The phone call Pierce is making accelerates toward completion. Yes, I'm documenting this for the state board. Yes, I have witnesses. No, she does not have standing orders to perform invasive procedures. His words land like accusations, building a case that will follow Laura into permanent unemployment, permanent erasure, permanent silence. That part of her strategy made sense 3 years ago when she first became invisible. Stay small. Don't fight. Let the erasure protect her daughter. But Reeves is turning grey on the monitor. His blood pressure collapsing. His oxygen saturation dropping into the range where brain cells start dying at a rate of approximately 4,000 per minute. Laura moves. Not toward Pierce. Not toward any of the 12 frozen doctors. Toward the crash cart. Her hands know exactly where the needle is, wrapped in sterile packaging, 14-gauge angiocath, the kind that punches through skin and muscle, and the parietal pleura covering the lung with enough force to release pressure, to save lives, to commit career suicide if she's not actually authorized to do it. The packet crinkles between her fingers as she tears it open. Behind her, Pierce's voice rises. She's assaulting my patient. Get security in here. Now. The 12 doctors shift their weight. Exchange glances. But they don't move. The fear of Pierce is larger than the fear of watching a man die. Laura reaches Reeves's bedside. Her fingers find the landmarks on his chest with the muscle memory of 17 rescue operations, of training that runs deeper than 3 years of civilian invisibility, of a body that remembers every anatomy lesson, every procedure, every moment when hesitation meant watching someone bleed out under an Afghan sky. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She presses her fingers into the space between his ribs, feels the anatomical signature of where pressure is crushing his lung, where a single centimeter will make the difference between survival and cardiac arrest. Stop her! Pierce screams into the phone, then at the nearest physician, restrain her! The physician doesn't move. Perhaps he recognizes something in Laura's posture, the absolute certainty of someone who has made decisions under fire, who has crossed points of no return. Laura doesn't look at any of them. She positions the needle. The antiseptic smell of the alcohol swab rises between them, sharp and chemical, cutting through the flat hospital air. She drives the needle through his skin. One motion. Confident. Precise. The hiss of air escaping is the loudest sound in the room. It fills the silence like a pressure relief valve opening, like a mechanism designed for exactly this moment finally being allowed to do its job. The sound is unmistakable to anyone who has ever heard it, the sound of a pneumothorax releasing, of pressure equalizing, of a man's lungs re-expanding. Reeves gasps. His chest heaves once. Twice. His oxygen saturation begins climbing, 76%, 81, 87, 91. His trachea shifts back to midline. The alarm stops screaming. The monitor settles into a steady sinus rhythm, the kind of rhythm that belongs to a living person instead of someone slipping toward cardiac arrest. Pierce's voice drops to a whisper on the phone. I want her arrested. Now. No, I don't care if she just saved his life. That's not how medicine works. That's not how anything works. His face has gone the color of wet concrete. Laura pulls the needle back slightly, leaving the catheter in place, the standard procedure for a tension pneumothorax, the textbook move that will allow continued decompression while protecting against reinflation. Her hands are completely steady. Her breathing hasn't changed. She hasn't even broken a sweat. One of the 12 doctors clears his throat. Another shifts his weight. The youngest resident, a woman who looks maybe 30, opens her mouth as if to say something, perhaps to defend Laura, perhaps to ask for an explanation, but Pierce's glare cuts across the room like a razor. She closes her mouth. The 12 doctors remain silent. The institutional fear is larger than professional ethics. The fear of being associated with defiance is larger than the evidence of competence standing in front of them. By 23:55, security arrives. 2 officers in Navy uniforms with badges that catch the fluorescent light. They don't look aggressive. They look confused. Laura is standing calmly beside Reeves's bed, checking his oxygen saturation one more time, 94% and stable. She looks up at them without resistance. "I'm ready," she says. The security officers exchange a glance. They've probably never arrested a nurse for saving someone's life. They probably never thought they would. But the paperwork Pierce has already filed, the phone calls he's made, the institutional machinery he's activated, it moves forward regardless of what actually happened, regardless of whether Reeves would be dead without the needle decompression. Laura walks out of the trauma bay with her hands visible, not because she's guilty, but because she's been trained to understand authority structures. Behind her, Pierce dictates to the state investigator with the intensity of someone trying to rewrite reality through sheer volume, practicing medicine without a license. Patient assault. Falsified documentation. Insubordination. 40 people witness her departure. Other nurses. Residents. Patients in the waiting room. A mother holding a child's hand, watching as a woman in scrubs gets escorted out by security. The image will stick. People will talk about it. The story will spread. By morning, Laura Bennett will be a rogue practitioner, not a nurse who saved a man's life. The conference room at 0300 hours smells like burnt coffee and the particular kind of fear that comes from having to fire someone while simultaneously protecting yourself from liability. The hospital's HR director and legal counsel sit across from Laura with a stack of papers between them. Termination for cause. Unauthorized practice of medicine. Insubordination. Assault. The pages feel heavy even though they're just paper. Laura's badge gets placed on the table. The photo shows a woman who looks like a different person, smaller somehow, less real. Her locker key follows. Her access card. The hospital has already begun the process of erasing her, just like the Pentagon did 3 years ago, just like every institution does when someone becomes too dangerous to keep around. Pierce sits in the corner, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man who has successfully weaponized the system. He's won. The rogue nurse is neutralized. His fraudulent billing documentation will be questioned by someone else now, someone who isn't standing in an ER with a shattered career. Laura signs the termination papers without reading them. The HR director looks uncomfortable, like there's something she wants to say but can't. The legal counsel looks relieved. By 03:15, it's done. Laura stands up. Walks to the door. Pierce doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. The system has already spoken. The drive home takes 15 minutes. Laura's hands grip the steering wheel with a steadiness that belies the fact that her life has just collapsed into a second erasure, a second disappearance, a second burial under institutional power. At 0900 hours, she sits at the kitchen table in her apartment wearing scrubs that now feel like an old costume. Her daughter Emma pads into the kitchen carrying a stuffed elephant, confused and sleepy. Purple pajamas. Tangled blonde hair from sleep. The image of normalcy that Laura has been protecting for 3 years. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma asks, the way only children can ask questions that cut directly to the heart of things. "You're always at the hospital in the morning." Laura tries to answer. Opens her mouth. Closes it. The words that would explain this, about Helmand Province, about classified files, about the Pentagon ordering her to disappear and stay disappeared, about how sometimes the only way to survive the system is to become invisible to it, those words can't be said to a 6-year-old. They can't be said to anyone. Emma climbs into her lap without waiting for an explanation. "Why are you crying?" she asks, because mothers aren't supposed to cry. Mothers are supposed to have it figured out. Mothers are supposed to protect their children from everything that breaks. Laura holds her daughter and has no answer she can give. Not the real one. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Pierce was already on the phone before Laura's hands had dried. The blood of the man she'd just saved was still tacky on her forearms as she stripped off her gloves, and Dr. Pierce stood in the corner of the trauma bay, receiver pressed to his ear, voice low and measured like a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed 100 times. She didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. The hospital administrator's expression told her everything. The security guard stationed outside the doors told her everything. The way the other 11 attending physicians suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere told her everything. Pierce had activated his network. The state nursing board. A medical investigator he'd gone to school with. A narrative already taking shape, a nurse who'd overstepped, who'd performed procedures beyond her scope, who'd fabricated documentation, who was dangerous. The allegations would stick long enough to matter. He'd learned that much in his 37 years of maneuvering through hospital hierarchies. Laura walked to the sink and let the water run hot. Steam rose off her skin like ghosts leaving a body. She didn't look at Pierce. She didn't acknowledge the phone call or the lies traveling through fiber optic cables toward people who'd never met her, never seen her work, never would. She simply washed her hands with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this ritual 10,000 times. Muscle memory took over. Surgical soap. Between the fingers. Under the nails where blood collects. The sound of water against stainless steel filled the small circle of space around her. By 3 a.m., Pierce had delivered his testimony to 3 board members. By 3:19 a.m., Seattle General's legal team had advised the hospital administrator to terminate Laura immediately to avoid liability. By 4:15 a.m., she was escorted to her locker by hospital security and told her employment was effective immediately terminated. 6 hours later, Emma found her at the kitchen table. She was still wearing her scrubs, still sitting in the same chair, staring at the cold coffee that had formed a skin across the top. Her daughter was 6 years old. Her daughter should have found her sleeping, peaceful, earned rest after a good shift. Instead, she found her mother with eyes that had seen too much again, tears that came quietly like rain on a still lake, all the composure finally breaking in the privacy of the house where nobody was watching. "Mommy, why are you home?" That was the question that broke something inside Laura's chest. Emma was supposed to be at school soon. Emma was supposed to have a mother who went to work at night and came home in the morning and was present and normal and safe. Emma was supposed to have a mother who didn't have classified records and hidden medals and a name that wasn't even her real name in half the places it mattered. Laura pulled her daughter into her arms and held her without speaking, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo, feeling the small weight of innocence that had never been to Helmand Province, never seen what hunger looked like in a child's eyes, never learned that the world could decide to erase you and there was nothing you could do about it. "It's okay, baby. Mommy just had a long night." That was the lie. But it was the only lie Emma needed to hear. The narrative was already being written without her. Dr. Pierce had made sure of it. 12 doctors had stood silent during the crisis. 12. That number would matter later in ways Pierce couldn't have predicted, but for now it simply meant that no one would contradict his version of events. No one would speak up for the nurse who'd saved the patient when all of them had frozen. Institutional self-preservation is a powerful narcotic, and most people never build immunity to it. 2 days later, the doors of Seattle General's emergency department swung open and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher with a bleeding man whose eyes were dark as charcoal, whose clothes were torn and stained with asphalt, whose body had been broken by a car accident in a way that required immediate intervention. The triage nurse was processing intake when the man's head turned slightly, following the movement of someone passing near the ambulance bay. His eyes went wide. They locked on Laura's face with the intensity of recognition that crosses time and distance and the deliberate erasure that governments impose on people. In Pashto, a language Laura had learned in the dust of Helmand Province, he whispered words that echoed across the ER like a name being called from a grave. The Angel of Helmand. Loud enough for the Marine liaison, a captain named Holloway who'd served 3 tours and knew the legends of forward operating bases better than anyone, to hear the words clearly. Loud enough to freeze the moment into something that couldn't be rewritten or explained away. The former Taliban fighter, now seeking asylum in the country he'd once fought against, had just spoken the call sign of the woman who'd extracted 17 wounded soldiers under fire from a compound in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province, a woman whose government had officially declared dead. Captain Holloway moved to Laura's side like a man who'd just been handed a classified document and was about to read it aloud to whoever wanted to listen. His jaw was tight. His eyes were harder than before. He pulled up secured channels on his phone with the authority of someone with the right credentials, and the first thing that loaded was a service record marked with so many redactions it looked like a document held together by fragments. But the fragment spelled out a name. A rank. A history written in unambiguous military terminology that would either destroy everything Laura had built or restore it completely. Captain Laura Bennett, he said, and the words hit the trauma bay like artillery. Silver Star recipient for extracting 17 wounded under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. Commendation for Valor. Her case file is restricted to clearance level. Pierce's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He was shouting about stolen valor and liability and unauthorized practice and everything else his desperate mind could assemble into a wall between the truth and its consequences. He was loud because the truth was louder, and loudness was the only tool he had left. It was the sound of a man whose entire network of power had just been short-circuited by the arrival of facts he'd never anticipated. That was when the doors burst open again and a man in dress uniform walked through with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding. Coast Guard General Marcus Webb. He'd come to Seattle General because the patient in Trauma Bay 4 was one of his own, and he needed to understand why a needle decompression had been performed on his officer in what appeared to be conditions of chaos and institutional cowardice. He was also carrying a classified briefing that had been activated the moment Laura's name surfaced in medical records again after 3 years of intentional obscurity. He saw Laura first. Then he saw the faded unit patch she'd kept sewn into the lining of her jacket, the same patch that Commander Reeves had worn in Helmand, the same symbol of their unit before the Pentagon had redrawn the boundaries of what was allowed to exist. Webb's posture changed. His hand came up in a salute that asked no permission and required no approval. A full military salute. To a woman in scrubs with blood still under her fingernails. To a captain whose decorations had never been claimed because claiming them would have required admitting she was alive. The silence in the emergency department stretched like taffy. It was the silence of 12 doctors realizing they'd stood paralyzed while a decorated officer did their job. It was the silence of Dr. Pierce understanding that the institutional power he'd spent years accumulating was dissolving like salt in seawater. It was the silence of a Coast Guard general acknowledging the woman who'd saved his officer's life with nothing but a surgical needle and the muscle memory of someone who'd learned field medicine in conditions that would have broken most people's minds. A nursing student named Rebecca who'd been standing near the medication station had filmed the entire vending machine confrontation 2 days earlier. She'd captured Dr. Pierce's voice dripping with contempt. She'd captured him asking if community college nursing programs even taught basic assessment. She'd captured the residents snickering. And she'd posted the video on social media with a single caption, "This doctor humiliated a Silver Star recipient." 20,000 shares by midnight. 50,000 by dawn. The video reached Johns Hopkins within 18 hours. It reached Dr. Ellen Marsh, the physician who'd written Pierce's letter of recommendation, the mentor whose professional reputation had been leveraged into his hiring. Dr. Marsh released a statement that morning, words that echoed through medical circles like a pronouncement of excommunication. She disavowed him. She demanded investigation. She acknowledged her error in recommending him. The statement was less than 200 words, but it was enough. It was enough because it gave institutional permission for everyone else to speak. The board acted within hours. They'd already received 3 anonymous tips about Pierce's billing practices. They'd already begun preliminary review of his treatment protocols. They'd already flagged the diagnostic imaging kickbacks. The CEO who'd taken his calls suddenly couldn't remember approving his allegations. The medical investigator from the state board who Pierce had gone to school with suddenly couldn't return calls. By day 4, the state medical board suspended his license pending investigation. By day 7, Seattle General terminated his employment. By week 3, his attorney negotiated a plea, surrender the license permanently, pay $600,000 in restitution, accept probation. No prison time. But the career was over. The power network was dismantled. The institutional protection was gone. By month's end, Pierce taught CPR certification classes at Front Range Community College. The basement classroom smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and broken ambitions. The dummy he demonstrated chest compressions on was named Rescue Annie. His students were high school kids earning service hours and bored EMT candidates scrolling their phones. One student recognized him from the viral video and snickered. Pierce pretended not to hear. He pressed his palms against the dummy's chest. 1, 2, 3. The same rhythm he'd probably learned 30 years ago, before he'd learned how to weaponize hospitals and destroy people with institutional precision. The dummy didn't object. The dummy didn't cry. The dummy just lay there and accepted the compressions, passive and forgiving in a way real people never were. For weeks later, Laura stood in Commander Reeves's hospital room. The chest tube was gone. The oxygen was off. The monitor showed a sinus rhythm at 72 beats per minute, steady as a metronome. He was sitting upright. Color had returned to his face. His eyes were clear. Seattle General had reinstated her with back pay, promoted her to clinical educator, apologized formally. The Coast Guard had cleared her to resume her real name and rank, though her combat deployments remained classified, would always remain classified. Some stories the government keeps locked in vaults where they belong. Some stories are too important to be told. Reeves focused on her face and she watched recognition move through his eyes like light through water. He'd last seen her in Helmand Province, 3 years before, when she'd loaded him onto a medevac helicopter with 2 gunshot wounds and a shattered collarbone. He'd been told she was dead. He'd attended a memorial service for a woman whose body had never been recovered because the woman hadn't actually died, just disappeared into the classified spaces where operators go when their usefulness to the Pentagon ends. "I knew you'd come back, Captain," he said quietly. "I told them you were too stubborn to stay buried." Laura felt something ease inside her chest, the kind of ease that only comes from being recognized by someone who'd earned the right to see you clearly. "You're still terrible at following evacuation orders, Commander." The sound of his laugh was like music in a hospital room, where music is supposed to exist only in the form of heart monitors and ventilators and the background hum of machines keeping people alive. Outside the window, the Colorado sunrise turned the Rocky Mountains gold, the same color as the silver star that was finally, after 3 years of hiding, permitted to exist in daylight. Emma had visited yesterday, old enough now to understand that Mommy did something brave and had to keep it secret to stay safe. The 12 doctors who'd stood frozen in the hallway now avoided eye contact when Laura passed. Dr. Chen had apologized. Laura had accepted. Some fears she understood. In the doorway, General Webb appeared, holding a shadow box containing her decorations and new orders. The Coast Guard wanted her back. She had 30 days to decide. Laura looked at the sunrise. She looked at the man whose life she'd saved twice. She thought about Emma, about night shifts, about the weight of secrets finally lifted. "I don't know yet," she said. She reached into her jacket lining and pulled out the faded unit patch, the one Reeves had worn in Helmand. She handed it to him. His fingers closed around it like he was catching something that might disappear again. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Subscribe, like, and comment. Tell us, would you have done the same?